Welcome to Disciple Dojo. Today we are going to be talking with a Psalms scholar. Some of you may know we've been teaching through the Psalms here on the channel. If you haven't seen those videos, check them out. They're in our Lyrics of the Psalms playlist, which is constantly growing. We just finished Psalm 19, aka C.S. Lewis's favorite psalm. And so it was great today getting to sit down and talk with Dr. Andrew Witt. Andy teaches up at Tyndale University up in Toronto, and he is currently writing a commentary. It will later be published by Cascade Publishers. So I wanted to sit down. I wanted to get his thoughts on some just general things to think about when studying the Psalms and ask him some particulars in terms of how the Psalms are organized. And then we looked at Psalms 42 and 43, which can, and he argues, and I think he's right on this, should be read as one psalm. And so this episode has some stuff for general readers, and it's got some stuff for Hebrew Bible nerds as well. And we are unapologetic about these type of long-form discussions. I think long-form biblical discussion, biblical teaching is the way to go. 30-second, 1-minute TikTok videos or shorts, they can only give you so much, and a lot of what they give is probably not worth. It's kind of like cotton candy. Looks substantial, but then as soon as you put it in your mouth, it's gone. And so we try to be the opposite of that here at Disciple Dojo. We try to go deep and discuss, train. That's the whole motif of a dojo, is a place where you come and train, you learn, you grow. That's just what we're about. And if you appreciate that and you want to help there be more of it, the best way you can do that is by subscribing if you haven't already. All right, let's talk about the Psalms with Dr. Andrew Witt. Dojo viewers, we are here with a bona fide Psalms scholar. We're here with Dr. Andrew Witt. And Andy, I want you to tell the folks just where you teach, what you do, what's your background, and how you ended up on Disciple Dojo, how you found out about us anyway.
Excellent. Well, Jan, thank you for having me here. Like you said, my name's Andy Witt, and I'm professor of biblical studies and theology at Tyndale University in Toronto, Ontario. He had on one of my colleagues, Rebecca Idestrom, a few months ago last year. But at Tyndale, we have both a seminary and a university. So if any American students want to save some money and come to Canada for a good liberal arts education, you're welcome at Tyndale.
Come on up. Where are you originally from?
I'm actually from the States originally. So I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, and did a lot of my secondary work in the US, and then came up for doctoral work in Toronto at Wycliffe College.
Yeah. What was the subject of your PhD?
So I worked on the Psalms, and especially Psalms 3 through 14. Christopher Seitz was my doctoral advisor.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, because this is the reason that you're here, is to talk about the Psalms. We've been slowly teaching through the Psalms here at Disciple Dojo. I used to do once a week Bible studies in person. And so I had to have the lesson prepared for the next week because there was like 50 people there. Now with YouTube, like there's not that demand. And so other things come up. And so we don't get to one Psalm a week, which I wish we would, but with everything else we do, it's just impossible. But we're trying to work our way through, Psalm 20 is what we're going to be on. Your wheelhouse is, you said Psalm 3 through 14. That's right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So why that doesn't compute to average viewers. They're like, right. What is it about why skip 1 and 2? And 2, why stop at 14? Like, what is the self-contained unit that you saw that made you want to dive in?
Definitely. Yeah. Great question. So I ended up not skipping 1 and 2. So maybe the title of the book is misleading, but I treat them along the way because you're right. You can't treat 3 to 14 without 1 and 2. But when I started my doctoral work, I was actually interested in a later section of the book of Psalms called Book 4. Mm-hmm. And so the book of Psalms, as your listeners probably know already, is divided into 5 separate quote unquote books. So Psalms 3 through 41, 42 to 72, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, and then 107 to 150. And so I'd initially thought I was going to work on Psalms 90 to 106, kind of that big group. But then there's a lot of stuff being published on those Psalms, and I felt like they were kind of treated, they were already treated. So I thought maybe I could go back and think of another area that really hasn't been talked about all that much. And I got drawn more and more into book 1, so Psalms 1 to 41. And I noticed there's kind of a big hole in scholarship at the very beginning. So Psalms 3 through 14. And kind of the reason to divide there is that a lot of scholars think Psalms 15 to 24 are a group of Psalms. So Psalm 15 talks about, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And that same question is talked about in Psalm 24. So those kind of questions kind of bookend that section with a lot of people thinking Psalm 19 is kind of the middle psalm there. And so kind of just pushing it back a little bit. And so 15 was the beginning of a new section, and 3 to 14 perhaps were another section. And so I knew I wanted to talk about those psalms in some way, but then the further I kind of got into it and was looking at them and trying to see how they come together, this question about who speaks in the psalms was something that I was drawn to more and more, especially as I got into the history of interpretation. And, I thought for the longest time that early interpreters of the Psalms just kind of thought Jesus was the one who speaks all the time. But when you actually read them, you find that's not the case, right? And they envision a whole slew of different ways that there are speakers in the Psalms. And so my question was, does the book of Psalms itself in some way try to show us how to hear them as we work our way through? And so that's kind of how the dissertation came about. And I kind of used Psalms 3 to 14 as like a test case to see really how Psalms 1 and 2 and then the superscriptions might set up how we hear who speaks in the Psalms.
The superscriptions, let's talk about that for a minute, because
Sure.
in English Bibles, most English Bibles that I know of, they are not numbered. They're just stuck there, and sometimes people skip right over them. But neither the Hebrew text nor the Septuagint do. In fact, the Hebrew text and the Septuagint both include the superscriptions as the first verse, which makes it confusing doing any Psalm study, because you always have to put brackets and which version numbers you're using, English or Hebrew, Greek. What is going on there? Do you have any idea? Does anybody have any idea how that practice came from?
My best guess is that it was kind of the devotional use of the Psalms. And so like the metrical psalters that came about in kind of the 1500s, 1600s, where you're putting the Psalms to music, you kind of just leave out the headings, because what are you going to do with those, putting those to music? And are you going to start off your song with, to the choir director or something, right?
Right.
It doesn't seem very practical to do that, even though I think you're right. Like these superscriptions are considered part of the scriptural text all throughout the early church. Both early Christian commentators and early Jewish interpreters are talking about these psalm headings as if they have some sort of meaning connected to the psalm that they're attached to. And even if you go back to our earliest post-biblical interpreters, so the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's these texts called the Pesharim. And in one of the Pesharim, we have comments on Psalm 42, and it includes the sons of Korah as part of its explanation of the psalm. And unfortunately, we're missing, it's very fragmentary, those texts. So we don't exactly know what they say about the sons of Korah, but we know they're saying something about them in context of what this psalm's about. So we've moved away from that quite a bit, I think, in the modern church, and seeing how these psalm headings connect to the Psalms. But it was kind of part and parcel of early Christian and early Jewish interpretation.
Yeah. It frustrates me that they don't number them, or they number them verse 0. I always tell viewers chapters and verses aren't inspired. They happen much later. They're just ways of, keeping everybody on the same page. And in this case, and a few other places in the Hebrew Bible, it does not keep everybody on the same page.
Yeah. And I think, it certainly, I think, informs us. I mean, it is, I think, the majority opinion that the psalm headings don't really have anything to do with the content of the Psalms. And so, our English translations kind of match that scholarly opinion, even though it disagrees with probably the previous 1,500 years of interpretation before that came about.
Yeah. Well, that can confuse some people. And so it's helpful to know. I always have to say when I'm teaching verse 1 in the Hebrew, verse 2 in the English, or something like that. You just have to.
And then it's not even getting into like the Psalms themselves are numbered differently depending on which tradition you're working with.
Yeah. Some are combined, and then
exactly.
Yeah, it gets crazy, but it's I think it's helpful to keep in mind during things like that these are songs these are hymns, these are liturgy, however you want. This is not narrative.
Right.
And so there is an element of fluidity in terms of how they're presented that you don't see in historical narrative or even prophetic stuff. So that's a little helpful. Were you a poetry guy before seminary, before?
I really tried to be, but I don't know what it is. Multiple times I've tried to get into English poetry and I haven't been able to.
Yeah.
I don't know why that's the case, but
yeah, no, I'm the same way.
Yeah.
And I would find myself like even reading Lord of the Rings, I would just skip over the Lord of the Rings fans are going to come out with pitchforks at me. But like all of the, just when Tolkien would get into a character telling some poetry, or I would be like, skip to the next section when the action picks up. And I think honestly, that's how a lot of people are with not just English poetry, but especially in the Bible, when they come to the Psalms, they're like, this is just saying a bunch of stuff the same way over and over. There's no story. There's no narrative. I don't see the purpose in this. And since so much of how we're taught to read the Bible is privately and devotionally rather than corporately and liturgically, at least in evangelical circles, it becomes less important. They become flowery poems that you read at a funeral, or maybe you put on a card when you're going to send somebody. So how do you, if you want to give some tips for people who are like, okay, they're like you, they're not into poetry. Like, I'm not feeling the poetry thing, but Psalms are quoted. They're the most quoted book in the New Testament, I believe.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So they clearly matter. How do we get into the Psalms? How do you start engaged? You got a brand new student. They love the Lord. They love studying scripture. They get to the Psalms and they're like, I just kind of blank out.
Well, the first thing is, of course, we have like our 2 Timothy 3 passage, right? Which talks about all of scripture being God breathed and it's transforming us, right, into servants of the Lord. And so from the get-go, whether you're reading like Numbers or Leviticus or the Psalms, all of these texts are shaping us. And so even if they're difficult to get into, it's important for us to hide them in our hearts, right? To have that there because the Lord is going to use it. So that's kind of the first thing. But then with the Psalms, I like how you mentioned that they do say the same thing over and over and over again. And I think that's part of discipleship too, is that there's a reason for this. If we wanted to take out all of the repetition, you might have 20 Psalms, right? But there's a reason why there's so many. And the fact that they repeat themselves again and again, you could take that as like, why am I bothering? But you could also take it as, why this might be really important for me to learn if the Lord felt the need for giving us so many of these Psalms again and again. So I kind of look at the repetition as a sign of the importance that these Psalms have. And, we have all these parables in the New Testament, like the persistent widow, right? Where, we're supposed to come to the Lord again and again and again. And the Psalms allow us to do that, right? Even if you're not sure what to pray, the Psalms can bring these same kind of prayers before the Lord again and again. So that's part of it. But I think for me, there's a couple of questions that I like to ask when I come to each Psalm. So one of those has to do with who might be speaking in this Psalm. And it's not an easy question to answer all the time, but I think in our kind of mind's eye, all of us have at least some indication of who we think is there, whether it's just myself praying, or is it Jesus praying? Is it David, right? Or maybe someone else in the Old Testament. We kind of start there. One of my colleagues up here in Toronto or in Canada named Derek Suderman, he harps a lot on this idea of not just who's speaking, but who are they talking to? Because I think when we read the Psalms, we often assume that the prayers are just to God. But as you've kind of looked at these Psalms up to Psalm 19 so far, they don't always talk to God, right? Psalm 4 addresses the sons of men, right? These people that have been, condemning David or the psalmist and kind of pushing him down, right? And so he addresses them directly. So it's not just a prayer to God, right? He's also confronting other people. And so paying attention to the pronouns that are used and who's talking to who, that really does make a difference. And that might help you to see that these Psalms they might be saying the same sorts of things, but they're not always saying them to the same people. And there's different contexts with each one. Those are some easy ways to kind of get into them. And another thing Suderman talks about that I've really appreciated is as kind of third-party listeners in on this Psalm, how do we envision ourselves there? Are we the ones talking with the psalmist? Are we the ones listening in on, this debate between like who's right and who's wrong? And we have to make a judgment on that? Or are we the people that the psalmist might be critiquing, right, or condemning. So how we kind of put ourselves into that audience makes a difference too. And none of those are right or wrong from the outset, but they're interesting kind of experiments to imagine where you fit. And I think that can help our spiritual lives quite a bit.
I really lament the fact, nice psalmic word, that we don't have music to sing them to, because them being originally songs, like people think, well, I could never memorize the book of Psalms. There's 150 chapters, 151 if you're Catholic, and I can't memorize this. That's too much. But you think about how many song lyrics you could identify and sing in your head off the top of your head, and it's probably 5 times as much as the song.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
We have the capacity. We just aren't presented with it. We don't drive in our car listening to someone singing these songs. And so to me, that's so lamentable, because I like thinking of analogies. And one of the ones that how the New Testament uses the Psalms, it's like ingrained. It's so ingrained in them that they just speak Psalmese, so to speak.
Yeah.
And, coming up in college, probably around college, late high school, college, and right after college, friends of mine would sit around any situation that come up. We could find a quote from Happy Gilmore or Anchorman or Billy Madison that had to do with whatever situation. It was like we had these quotable lines in our head. And that's what memes are. I mean, in modern day, memes just become, a shared vocabulary that we apply from one situation to another. And I feel like the Psalms, on an actual inspired and meaningful level, a lot of times the New Testament authors are doing something similar. The Psalms are such a part of their vocabulary that they can almost offhandedly, like Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think that there's theological insight, but I also think that song was so in his mind because of what he had grown up singing and knowing his being the suffering servant, and that this was all culminating at this point. And it's like, the words are already there. And so I feel like that's my hunch. What do you think about any of that? Or is there a better way? Yeah. Is there another way that you prefer to see how the New Testament authors, how the Psalms functioned in their lives?
Yeah, definitely. Well, you certainly have those, like in the book of Ephesians and Colossians, right? Paul talks about, we sing and we teach psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And I know I came to faith when I was in university. And so I remember hearing about this and kind of being discipled. And the idea is like, you have the Psalms, but then you have to come up with your own worship songs. And, and we have our hymns from, our great hymn books. And then you have these spiritual songs, which are things that you kind of make up, these new songs maybe that you sing to the Lord. But what's interesting is those words that are used in Ephesians and Colossians, the Psalms, the hymns, and the spiritual songs, are psalm titles from the book of Psalms. So I'm not sure if Paul is saying 3 separate kinds of music or literature, but right. I think he's just saying use the full Psalter as you're teaching and singing.
Yeah.
So I think that's clearly there. And when you see the Psalms being used by the early church, like I'm thinking about like the book of Acts, when Peter and John come back from being arrested, right? And they sing they pray through Psalm 2 as a community. They're applying that, right, to their own situation. And I think that gives us a window on how, of course, we're so many years later, but in the same sort of way, how are we fitting into these larger purposes and plans of God? And it's not all that different, really, how we might apply that psalm to our own situation. So we have some examples there on how that could work. And I'm also thinking of a few centuries later, right, when you have someone like Athanasius or Augustine or Jerome kind of writing on the Psalms, or John Chrysostom, right? They envision, the way that Psalms were being used in society. Like they talk about, they're walking down the road and they're hearing farmers singing through the Psalms as they're working. And so there's this like wonderful picture of like exactly the situation that you're thinking of in some ways, right? Where this is just part of the church's life, whether you're at home, like they didn't really, I guess, study at home. They didn't have Bibles, right? Like we do. But, whether you're at church thinking through these Psalms as the preacher talks about them, or you've memorized them and now you're in the fields meditating on them by singing them day in and day out. I think those are wonderful ways to put these things at work, and the way you think and the new knowledge you're taking in from life. How does that fit into God's world,
Mm.
the Psalms kind of become, in a way, a filter for thinking through how that all works together. So,
Yeah.
and I could definitely use a lot more work at putting them in part of my own life that way. But
I think
that,
we all could.
yeah,
Yeah, for
yeah,
sure. I just remember I grew up as a United Methodist. My dad's a United Methodist pastor, and up until
yeah.
last year we were. And I remember, like, I could rattle off right now the Apostles' Creed because we said it
Mhm.
every Sunday as part of the service. The
Yeah.
doxology, I could sing that. We sang it every Sunday. And I just look back and think, why did the church, big picture church, not our church, all church, why have we not done that with the Psalms to the same degree, and that's part of why I want to study them and want to present them to viewers is there's just such a lack of familiarity, and people have written incredible works on the Psalm. I mean, like, what did you think about C.S. Lewis's work on the Psalms? Have you read his book?
Yeah, his reflections on the Psalms. I like it quite a bit. And I just appreciate how honest he is as he's working through it, right? I know, like, that was a book that kind of got him in trouble with, the kind of, I mean, I guess evangelicals weren't really around at that time, but the more kind of conservative, traditional readers that, appealed to his apologetics, they didn't like it because he was messing with their view of inspiration and how these texts kind of come in. So I really appreciate just kind of the candor he has, and he's sensitive to the different cultural factors at work in the ancient world and in our world. And those are things that people really didn't think through, 60, 70 years ago as much. So I appreciate a lot of what he does there.
Yeah, well, let's talk about just real quick the imprecatory Psalms, because that is one of the things. Like, I love C.S. Lewis, and I can count on probably one hand the number of times where I read something he writes and I'm like, no, I think you're wrong, Clive. But that's one of them is his view of the imprecatory Psalms. I don't share it. I think they are as inspired by God as any other part of Scripture. But I do understand Lewis's aversion to them and modern Christians' aversion to them. What do you tell your students when they ask you, hey, why am I reading about someone singing of bashing babies' heads against rocks and smashing the teeth of so-and-so? And this seems to be what they're asking God to do. Why is that in my Bible? And as a Christian, how can I do that and still love my enemy and pray for those who persecute me?
Great. Yeah. Hard question to answer. And it's one of those ones that I think we have to be careful with how we answer, because I agree with you that all the Psalms are important, and that even these imprecatory parts we need to pray. But I think that we have to pray them with a bit of fear and trembling, I think. So usually with this discussion, I start off by asking my students, should Christians pray that the Lord would stop human trafficking from happening? And they all look at me like, well, of course, we should pray for that. And I was like, well, what do we mean when we pray for that? Like, how do we envision God stopping human trafficking? Like, what does that actually look like in real life? These evil structures and systems that have been built up generations, right? Are they just suddenly going to fall? Or, are these wicked men and women just going to be like, here's my weapons. Sorry, let me go to jail. Like,
my bad.
We can pray for that. I mean, but like, in the reality is it's going to be a lot more brutal than that, right? And so we have these really great prayers for justice, but we don't really have words that we like to use in English to actually describe what we want God to do. And so part of me is like, are the psalmists just being a lot more open? Be like, well, here's what I want you to do, God. I want you to end this. And what I often find is that the psalmists don't use literal language to do this. They use a lot of figurative language. So like in Psalm 3, Absalom, he's clever, right? He's been working behind the scenes at the gate, giving justice to people, making wise decisions. He's winning over the heart of the people. And so when he's staging this coup against David, I am 100% sure there was some sort of political propaganda campaign going on and saying, the Lord's behind me, not behind David anymore, right? And so there's these slogans that kind of go out, right? That God no longer supports David. I think that's what, there's no salvation for him and the Lord's really about. So how does David pray that God would deliver him? Well, what's the organ that people have used to sow this hatred of him? It's their mouths, right? And so where does he envision God striking his enemies in the mouth? Now, he uses a lot more flowery language, right, to do that.
Right.
So he's asking for something that's appropriate, right? How does we want God to stop what they're doing, right, with their lips and with their tongues and with their mouths, and so stop that. Or Psalm 10, when we have this really in-depth description of what the wicked are like. Right at the end of there, we have an imprecatory prayer that God would break the arm of the wicked.
Right.
And, with biblical figurative language, the arm is the power, right? So break the power of the wicked. But he is talking about their arm, right? Break their arm.
Yeah, yeah.
And there is something that's like visceral about that, right? But it's something that like, it's appropriate, right? They're coming out of the bushes, swinging weapons and like taking advantage of the vulnerable. So break that, When we look at it that way and we kind of think about prayers that certainly are appropriate now, we might not use that same descriptive language, but I think we'd be naive if we were thinking we're praying for something any different than what they're praying for.
Yeah. Do you think it has to do with, do you think there's a level of suffering that was more common to people in the ancient world that we as Western affluent Christians just can't really relate to?
I think, yeah, for sure. I mean, and you saw a bit of the panic during the COVID pandemic, right? And, as disastrous as that was, right? That doesn't even reach any of the levels really of the suffering that people have suffered throughout history, but how that just stopped society.
Yeah.
We're not used to that kind of suffering at all. And we don't know how to pray through it. And so I think the Psalms help us there quite a bit. And, there's been a lot of, in Toronto, as I'm sure that in every other big city, but, there's been a lot of scandal in the church, and some of it is just people not speaking up about things until 20 years later, which we know is, I'm not holding them accountable for that, but like it's traumatic what people go through. But I think, if we were a church that was more informed by these calls for justice, I think it'd be interesting to see how this would empower people to speak to these things more publicly, than,
that's a good point.
So it gives you confidence that the Lord actually does care about these things,
right.
and so bring down the wicked, and maybe that's my pastor, right? Which is sad to say, right? But maybe that's the case, and these can be powerful.
I've toyed in my head with saying, we're to pray for leaders, but we can pray for them to be removed. Like we can pray imprecatory psalms when appropriate, not just because I don't like this person, but like if there is a leader or someone in a position of authority and they are abusing others, they are wolves in sheep's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the times when I think the imprecatory prayers exist. I think it was Miroslav Volf who talked about, having lived through the Balkans in the 90s and the ethnic cleansing and all of the just horrors that he saw. I believe in Inclusion and Embrace, I think he did it in that, but he sort of chided Western academics for having their distaste for the imprecatory psalms because there are no better words. Like when your entire village has been ethnically cleansed and you've had to watch your family members be raped in front of you and then killed after being raped in front of you, and then you being left to live to go tell your other people this is going to keep happening. I mean, just those things that we don't even have words to describe those horrors. I couldn't imagine telling that person, well, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, love your, like before giving them the vocabulary of lament and imprecation and letting them know clearly and unequivocally, God hates what has happened to you, like hates it. And then on the other side, you can start to, maybe the Spirit can apply a fuller peace and a love towards the interview. But I think we short circuit it the process when we kind of try to skip the imprecation or skip the lament, go straight to the good stuff.
Because we do, I'm just thinking off the top of my head now, but even in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus starts with the Beatitudes, right? Which give a place for mourning, right? But we skip those to just mention those later parts like you just did. Right? But I think that's just the way we're wired, is to think that way, right? But I think the general history of Christianity and Judaism really, I think, shows us that the Psalms have played a really core component of the spirituality of God's people. And I think, for the vast majority of history, this was, suffering was much more part of everyday life. The last 150 years or so in the West, especially in North America, we've been pretty blessed in terms of the suffering that we've had to endure. I mean, yeah, just like the development of medicine has just completely changed the way we experience life, right?
Or telecommunications, or the ability to get news and be informed about, I mean, with all that comes the dark side, misinformation and, crackpot doctors. And there's the bad side of everything, for sure.
Yeah.
But the psalmist seems so far away sometimes because their prayers are the prayers of people in such a different culture when there were no such things as police. I mean, we just take that for granted. There were no police in the ancient world on a day-to-day basis. There were the things that we just assumed they didn't have. And so their prayers, I think, are different in their form, in what they're praying, how they're singing, how they're rejoicing. But what they're praying for is remarkably the same. It looks different culturally, but the longings and if anybody's ever been slandered, like really slandered, like had your life ruined by slander, you can read the Psalms a little differently, especially these early ones in David and during the Absalom period that you're talking about.
Yeah, so I see these prayers in the here and now, right? And they're prayers for God to act on his character, right? And to be the God of his people that he says he is. And it doesn't mean you're going to get what you want right away, right? I think this is what the parables and the gospels teach us, or even just looking at the history of God's people, what that teaches you. But these, just the consistent praying of these sorts of psalms over time, it attunes your heart, right, to God's ways, God's character. And he does promise to answer his people. But, I kind of think of, Jeremiah, right, when he tells the people in Babylon, right, in Jeremiah 29, right, to settle in and create generations and work for the shalom of the city, right, which is such a wild thing to pray. But we have this bumper sticker verse, right? I know the plans I have for you, right, to prosper it. But those, that prayer was not going to be answered for 3 generations, right? Like it wasn't going to be until 70 years later that people would finally be able to come back into the land of Canaan, right? And land of promised land. And so how would we pray in a situation like that, right? Like, would we be the ones that would be like, I know God's not going to answer this for 3 generations, but I'm going to pray it anyway? That kind of changes the way we think about persistence, and it gives us a bit of patience and, an understanding of our lives within God's bigger purposes and plans.
Yeah, it's longer
right?
time.
And not just for exactly. And not just they're prayers for the here and now, but at the same time, they're bringing us up into, right, God's purposes and plans for history, how we fit into them.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking at the abstract level or at the big picture level collectively. So let's look, you sent me your translation of Psalms 42 and 43. And so I'm going to throw those up on the screen. Viewers, you should be able to see on the right is Andy's translation. And then on the left, I just have the Biblica Hebraica. And so we can go through, you can walk us through the Psalm. And so before we start, why when I asked you, share a Psalm that you think is, either one of your favorites or one that you like to deal with. So 1, why these 2, and 2, why combine them?
Yes, great question. So part of my translation of the Psalms is I'm writing a commentary on the Psalms for a new series called The Bible in God's World that Cascade is publishing. And hopefully, I think there's just 1 volume out right now, Ecclesiastes, but I know people are working on them. So hopefully in the next year or 2, we'll see more of these come out. And so this translation is part of like larger commentary work I'm doing on the book of Psalms. And, part of the reason for this one is it's just such a classic psalm in some respects, right? There's, as the deer pants upon streams of water, right? There's just language that's been just part of our larger spiritual life. No matter what denomination we're from, we know like
you probably sang this as a youth camp or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's something special about this, but I've noticed like this is one of those psalms. It's like Psalm 23. That it's just a favorite for a lot of people. And so, when you're working on a commentary, you have a certain word limit you're at. And so part of the way I was working through this was just trying to think through what are, I don't like to prioritize certain psalms over others, but like, what are the ones that I really need to nail down well, right? And like a Psalm 23 or a Psalm 2, a Psalm 1. And Psalm 42 and 43, I think, fit into they're important in that respect. Now, the reason I tie them together is that we don't have a psalm heading for Psalm 43. And if you scroll, I don't know if you can scroll down on my translation at all.
Yep.
And I put it in italics there, right? We do have this refrain that happens in verse 5 or verse 6 in the Masoretic tradition. It happens there, and it happens at the end of Psalm 42. The same kind of refrain is used again.
All of verse 5?
Yeah, all of verse 5 is pretty much repeated. And then again at the end of Psalm 43 and 43 verse 5.
Okay.
And so even though they're divided in our Bibles, right, 42 and 43,
right,
you can kind of track the progress of thought through all three of those refrains and leading up to them. So I think there's some good justification for considering them one psalm instead of two,
right?
Even though I think even the Septuagint doesn't consider them one psalm, which sometimes they do, like with Psalm 9 and 10.
Right.
Yeah, so that's why I've put them together. Obviously people disagree about that, but that's kind of what I did with that one.
Yeah, well, you're the one writing the commentary, so
exactly right. I can do my own thing.
Well, let me ask you right off the bat. So.
Yeah.
When I'm teaching through these, there's certain terms I just transliterate because I don't I don't know enough to say, yes, this is part of what it means. Lemnatseach is one of those that I just leave it. And then maskil is another one. So you've translated Lemnatseach for the leader.
Yes.
And which is very, very standard. I know the Septuagint has it for the end.
Yes.
I guess it's a participle and that's how you're taking it. So you can nerd out with the Hebrew on this.
Sure.
We have enough people that are familiar with the languages to follow along, and the others can just nod until we catch up. But yeah, how did you get these two? What's your logic in translating those that way?
Well, maskil is more with fear and trembling. I've translated that one. But Lamnatseach it's a bit more easier to talk through. It has a really fascinating history of interpretation. So the root here is natzak, right? So the nun, the tzadi, and the chet.
Yep, these last three.
And before the Masoretic text was pointed, right? So before it has the vowel points added to the text, right? There were different traditions on how to pronounce words, right? Before that point. And this is one of those words where we get to see a lot of wiggle room, I guess you could say, with how to interpret it. Because natzak is a word that can be associated with things like glory or brilliance or light, which is where we get kind of the figurative connection to leadership, right? Someone who's in a position that's like high up. Or it's a word that can be associated with like durability or endurance. And so the Septuagint famously says for the end, right? The telos. And the Vulgate follows. But when you dig into all these early Christian and Jewish sources, what you find is, interestingly enough, none of them actually associate this with worship leaders at all, which I kind of found unbelievable to a certain extent. But they all kind of translate this in that figurative sense of God's glory or, for the end. And in Christian interpretation, that usually talked about Christ as the telos. So connecting it to the spiritual life and, God perfecting us in the end and things like that. But once you get to the pointed text, like we have it today, this connects us back with the book of Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, where this root is used to talk about the Levites who had oversight during temple construction or reconstruction. And I think the idea is that they were kind of leading music as people were working. So it's a very specific context. I think sometimes when we see for the leader, we just assume this is the worship leader who would get up at any point in Israel's story, which I guess could be the case. But specifically in those texts, it's always associated with some kind of like rebuilding effort at the temple or the walls of the city. And so it's for the end, right? Or for eternity, forever, something like that. So we do have a slightly different spelling there that I do think is important. And, part of me hates disagreeing with the whole history of interpretation on this, but I do think the insights that were made, like the Masoretic text was pointed this way for a reason, right? And I do think that connection with the leaders is appropriate. So that's how I'm rendering it in my translation.
So would you say the leader is in a liturgical sense, or is this a broader sense of leading?
I think it's in a liturgical sense. And in that monograph I put out on Psalms 3 to 14, I went off on my own a little bit here and I made some. So one of the things I really like about the history of interpretation is how they connect together things to the spiritual life. And I also come from, there is kind of a transformation of meaning that happens, and especially Erasmus. And so he gives this like tropological meaning. So yes, it does point to a worship leader, but what was the point of the worship leader? What was the worship leader? What was their role? And it was to encourage the people, right? To get them to sing this song. And so for me, kind of the canonical meaning of this term, why it's still there, is that this is a psalm that helps us and encourages us in that effort. Now, why isn't it on, certainly every psalm could be that way, perhaps, but maybe just taking these as little reminders along the way, right? As you move to the next one, that hey, think about how this is encouraging you to do the work of building the temple. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a bit out there, I don't know, but I think that can be helpful in a more practical way than ignoring it, for sure.
Yeah, well, definitely that. And like I said, I just leave it transliterated because I don't know, but that's why I want viewers to watch this. And so now whenever we come to Lemnat in the text, they'll at least have a little bit of background, a little bit of context, what it could mean. Because a lot of times you'll see when I'm teaching through the Psalms, I have to interpret the decisions that different translations make for viewers. Like that's my goal, because I hate Bible tribalism, and I hate people saying, "Oh, this translation is just making stuff up," or "This is." They're not, and they're not dummies. Right. And the Septuagint authors, it's not like they didn't know Hebrew. So there's got to be reasons for all of these things, but those don't get put in footnotes. I mean, unless it's like the Net Bible, which everything gets put in those footnotes.
Yes.
But, so that's what I want Disciple Dojo is trying to help people see into the debate or into the options and to know that, there's some things that are ambiguous, and that's okay.
Yeah.
You can have ambiguity, and you can do like I like what you said. Like, this is my attempt. I'm writing the commentary. We have to say this is what we think, and that's exactly what you should be doing. Now, so tell me about Maskil, because this one doesn't get touched by most English translations at all. They just leave it and say it's an obscure musical term.
Right.
So how did you get giving consideration? Walk viewers through that choice.
Yeah. Like I said, this was like a fear and trembling one.
Right.
Maybe when you pick up the commentary in a few years, I'll put Maskil instead. Maybe I'll change my mind. But yeah, I think like you're right. Like once you learn Hebrew and Greek and you start reading these translations, you realize like they're all really good.
Yeah.
And this is especially if you're trying to translate on your own, it's like, it's very difficult, right? So these committees that have been put together in these translations they're doing wonderful work. And even if you disagree with how they would render something, it's usually not a complete disagreement. It's usually just adjusting a little thing here or there. But yeah, giving consideration. So you're right. Maskil is a word that's left transliterated. But one thing I noticed was every commentary I picked up just basically said, well, we know it comes from the root sakal, which has to do with skill, like having some sort of skill or growing in knowledge and becoming wise or becoming skillful, becoming an expert in some area. But none of them would translate the term, even though we're pretty sure it has to do with this meaning there, right? And so I was like, I'm just going to go for it and try to figure out how to translate this. So I actually used Psalm 41 to help me here, because at the beginning of Psalm 41 and verse 1, there we go. So you see Maskil's right there, right?
Yes.
Right. So blessed, right? Or the blessings of
the Maskil,
the one who considers the poor, right? Or gives consideration to the poor on the day of trouble.
Okay.
Right. So I just found it interesting that like the previous Psalm, you're having read through it, and it's an illustration of giving consideration to the poor, right? And what does that even look like? And so, I know that this isn't the only instance of Maskil in the Psalms, but for the very next Psalm to start with Maskil, I think there's a link there. Even though we're jumping from the end of book 1 into book 2, there is a link connecting those two Psalms. And perhaps that's informing us on how to understand Maskil. That this is another Psalm about how maybe God gives consideration to the poor, or give me consideration, maybe, right? So I think that could be behind there. And again, some of this is spitballing, right? And trying to just imagine how to translate this term, but
right. Well, that's what translations all have to do. Is through usage. It's not like there's an objective dictionary that everyone appeals to. It's like usage determines meaning. And that's a very good, this looks like a Hiffiel participle.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
My Hebrew is not great when it comes to the stems, but Hiffiel participle for viewers who are super grammatically clueless, participle is ing, playing, running, jumping. So this Andy's translating as giving consideration.
Now, it can be taken as the one who does give consideration, right? So the person that does this kind of thing. And that's how some of the commentaries talk about it, that this was written by someone who is an expert in their skill. So this is, for the leader from someone who has expertise, right? Something like that. Or someone who has given consideration. Yeah. Which could be the case too, but I kind of like it as helping to set up how do we pray this psalm and what that might mean.
All right. Well, let's do one more before we move on. And then I want to have you just walk us through the psalm. But these are the preliminary things. And I don't get to ask psalm scholars these questions. So, Livnei Korah, the sons of Korah.
Yes.
Who are the sons of Korah? And why did they write so many psalms?
In the Pentateuch, we first hear about the sons of Korah in Korah's rebellion.
Yeah, they're not great.
No, they're not great, right? So this is one of the interesting dynamics of the sons of Korah. So we have, famously in the book of Numbers, we have Aaron and Miriam kind of push back against Moses's prophetic leading of the people, right? And the Lord, right, gives them, I think, leprosy. And then a bit later, we have the sons of Korah, led by Korah, rebelling against the priestly leadership of Aaron, the Aaron branch of the Levites, right? So the Korahites are also Levites.
Right.
They want to be the ones that are involved with the sacrifices, right? Not Aaron's sons, right? So there's this, why does Aaron get to lead? And so part of this rebellion then, famously we have the earth open up and you have Korah's entire family falling into this pit. But a little bit later, I think what's interesting about the sons of Korah, and I'm trying to remember the exact.
And this was the incident where Aaron's staff budded to show his leadership. That was, if viewers remember that.
So not all of the sons of Korah actually died. Some had survived, but the reason they survived is to be a sign for the people moving forward, right? About rebellion and what happens with rebellion. So the Psalm scholars that do connect this story back to the sons of Korah see some really interesting kind of themes that might pop out of there, because you have kind of a redemptive story in a way that the sons of Korah involved in the book of Chronicles as part of the Levitical guild, at the temple. So they are considered prophets, right? As all the different people that are involved in the Psalm superscriptions are. And so there is this prophetic capacity that's part of the sons of Korah. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're predicting the future. Prophecy is looking backwards, like a book of Kings or the story of Joshua. It's a prophetic author writing about God's role in history, right? What God has done in the past. You have someone like Nathan, right? Who's like speaking into the present to David. And then you have, more predictive kind of prophecy. So, the sons of Korah being prophetic doesn't necessarily mean that they're predicting the coming of Christ or something like that. They could be just speaking about, they're giving us God's instructions for everyday life. Like that could be part of it too. So I do see them having a prophetic capacity, but then I think also their kind of history there that God does rescue out of really horrible situations. And there is something redemptive about God's work, which seems very appropriate for Psalm 42 and 43, because that's part of the themes that we have here.
Yeah. Well, then let's get into the psalm right off the bat. You've got to justify another translation, and because you're
with a lot of
readers going to be like, "Wait, what? I sung this in my youth camp as the deer panteth for the waters, so my soul longeth after you." You've got as you were. So you're taking this as a second person rather than a third person feminine. You're taking it as a second person.
Yeah.
So what's going on in this verse then?
I know. I kind of want to hide my face. I'm ruining everybody's favorite verse. Right off the bat, one of the things that struck me was the word for deer that's here, aisle. It's a masculine singular verb. It's a masculine singular noun.
Yeah.
And the verb is usually taken as a third feminine singular. but because it can be, right? But it could also be taken as a second masculine singular, right? So imperfects have the same pointing for those two verb forms.
Yeah.
And what I found fascinating was when you look at the lexicons, they don't list the word deer as a noun that could be masculine or feminine. They list it as masculine, except this one usage, which is kind of an exception to the rule, right? Which is a weird way for a lexicon to do that. So I came across an article that came out in 2021 by this guy named Jonathan Nathan. And the verb that's used here with the ayin, the resh, and the gimel, right? So arag, it's only used 3 times in the Old Testament. So twice here in Psalm 42, verse 2, and then in the Joel chapter 1, and it's the same form in all 3 places. But when in his study, he looked at Joel 1:20, he noticed that it's also this either third feminine singular or second masculine singular. And the noun that it's usually associated with is a masculine plural. So who's the subject of these verbs? Now, the use in the second line here with nafshi for my soul, that is a feminine singular noun, right? So that does match. But in that first line, we don't have a matching noun with the verb. And so this guy, Jonathan Nathan, his solution was to say, well, maybe we should translate it as a second masculine singular, where God is the subject, and that the noun that's associated is not the subject, but the object of the verb. And so that's kind of where this translation comes from. And he also argued that panting wasn't the best translation of that word, the verb either. It's a very obscure word, and it's kind of connected to, I say turning here, but inclining or bending with some of like how it's used in Arabic. So instead of it as a deer pants for water, so my soul pants after you, O God, he's kind of starting off by talking about God's already kind of at work changing his view, right? And changing his heart, his soul, his, the orientation of his life in a way that this is already, God's already working on that. And that does fit with the general theme of the psalm as well, where the psalmist is trying to move from this place of lament to a place of praise once again. So this turning or the bending or the inclining of my soul is also very fitting. But I hate to do a complete different translation of a really important verse for people.
Yeah.
But I don't know in the end if it actually changes the tenor of it that much. But
right.
I do think it's important to have the most accurate translations we have either way.
Yeah. Well, it comes down to, it seems like it comes down to the meaning of arag, how you translate that.
Yes.
And it's a very obscure word. And so panting or longing for is uneducated guess among lexicographers, but there's also another possible meaning you're saying for longing for or inclining, moving, turning, swaying something to one other path. And so in that case, it also hinges on, and viewers may not know this, but third feminine singulars, she blanked versus second masculine singulars, you blank. Like it's the same in Hebrew, which is maddening for Hebrew students. It's just,
it is.
That kind of stuff is super annoying. But every Hebrew student, every first semester Hebrew student knows that. So you're taking the case that this is an example of the feminine singular, the second person singular.
And we do have the vocative here, like to you, O God, right? So there is already the kind of indirect sense, like we're already addressing the second person as part of the verse. So I thought there was a good case for this. And initially, I just wanted to translate it this way just to see what would happen with the psalm. And I ended up liking it quite a lot. So it's as good of a translation as the other one. There's just as much justification for this one. And you actually don't have to do any emendations of the text or make any exceptions.
Right.
You can just kind of translate it as it is.
Well, the image stays. The image remains. There's a thirsty deer. It's just, is it just the deer thirsty, or has God inclined the deer towards where the water is?
Yes.
Because deer's thirsty.
So like providence is at work, right? And I think there's something there that I really like about this psalm too, is that just as God is rescuing his creatures, so he's at work rescuing me, right? And turning my soul towards him. And I think that comes out by the time we get to the end of the psalm. I think that turning in some ways has happened, but the psalm ends with this kind of lamentful refrain. So We don't quite get all the way there yet. It's still a work in progress, but there's some progress that has been made.
So it opens with the image of, and anybody that's been to the Holy Land, coming upon streams of water is monumental, especially in the ancient world. So an animal thirsty, finding water is the image of my soul thirst for God, the living God. And then where do we go from there? So God, El Chai, living God.
Yeah, the living God,
So then keep walking us through the Psalm. So what's next?
So this question, when will I come and appear before God's presence? Right? So we know that the psalmist is, separated from God in some way. We don't know why that has happened.
Right.
But something has happened that, brought about the kind of this lament that something's been lost, right? When will I come again and appear before God? Because we will get back to, in verse 4, what life used to be like, right? A remembrance of when he was before God and the joy that was found in doing that. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but
no, keep going. Yeah.
There will be this recollection of the past and how good things were compared with how kind of desperate things are now. But I think with verse 1, depending on how you translate it, right, that there's either this longing that the psalmist has for God, or it's this sense that God is beginning to, that longing might have been lost for a little bit, right? Maybe this is one of those dark nights of the soul situations.
Well, that certainly sounds like it in verse 4.
Yeah, like depending on how you do that first verse, you can have some different ways of talking about it. But so I just love this water imagery is so great in this psalm. So it's, my soul is thirsting for God, but the thirst is tears. So my tears have been for me food, right? Day and night. So it's unlike the deer who's been feeding upon streams of water. He's had these salty tears he's had to lick off of his cheek, which is no substitute, right, for these perennial springs that you might find. So it's been like, tears have been the food instead of the life-giving water that he longs for. And I just think back to Psalm 1 at the beginning of book 1, right? You have meditating on the Torah day and night, this transplanting beside streams of water. And I think what the psalmist is, if you're supposed to connect those two, maybe in the beginning of book 2, the psalmist is not experiencing that in his life, right? Day and night, it's his tears, right, that have been there. And instead of hearing Torah, right, in verse 3, it's said to him throughout the day, where's your God, right? It's like this taunt. So it's almost like the opposite situation of Psalm 1, right, where he's kind of forced to consider the scoffers, right? This is, or the wicked taunting him throughout the day. So it really paints this scene for us, right? A really difficult situation to be in, right? This sense of being separated from God, and even the community around you is like rubbing that in your face.
The next line, verse 5, I like how you translate that. Let me remember these things. Let me pour out my soul within me.
Yes.
And that's how you're taking a lie, I believe.
Yeah.
I will pour out
upon me or within me. Yeah. So there's this, he's talking to himself, right? And we do this all the time, right? To encourage ourselves or to pump ourselves up, before we get into some kind of sporting thing, right? We just get that pump up music or something, right?
Yeah.
But he's, there's something here, he's not yet ready. I mean, he did say, oh God, in that first verse, but he's dealing with himself, right? Yeah. And there is a sense of trying to understand where he's at, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a longing for the past, right? I used to pass over with the throng, walked with them in procession to the house of God. I kept festival, right? It's just this joyful environment.
Yeah, back when he was spiritually on fire and fervent.
Yeah,
and
right.
Everything was good.
Or and I mean, this could be, the sons of Korah are also associated with the northern kingdom. So maybe this is a separation from the temple in the north. Maybe they've been exiled. We just don't know how that works, because they did have a very clear understanding of God's presence at the temple, and not necessarily the same way we would talk about being indwelled with the Spirit and taking God with us kind of everywhere we go, right? So there is a sense of I'm not there anymore. And that was, it was amazing, right? It's like going to a festival, right? And just changing your life. That's what he's recalling. But then you have the speaking of the soul in verse 5, right? Or verse 6 in the Masoretic.
Yeah.
this going down, right? Why have you become turbulent within me, right? So there's this, I just think about like the image that we get, right? When something's desperately wrong, our stomach churns, right? And there's this like sense of like ominousness within us, right? And we're just gurgling in the insides. And so there is this kind of shrinking down in size, and the environment around him is just causing him to, like, his body's responding, right, to what's going on. And so he just cries out.
So tell me, let me ask a little bit real quick about this verb, hama. And you're translating it as become turbulent, or you're translating the sheikh. I think
sinking down,
traditional translations say downcast. But sinking down.
It's more of like a literal, trying to get the literalness of that verb in there a bit more.
Which for the sons of Korah, that's actually a good.
Exactly, right? Sinking down into Sheol, right?
So then for hama, temi, you have translated as being turbulent. Like Accordance just has it glossed as to roar. What do you know where else this is found, or how did you get turbulent from this?
I think that was just me, maybe like, with this word hama, just waxing poetically maybe a little bit, right? I'm just looking at halit, right? To make noise, or to be tumultuous, to roar like the seas, to make a sound, like to groan like a bear, to bark like a dog. And then, to be restless or to be turbulent, right? And so that's where I'm getting that from. So it's kind of this restlessness, but I do the water imagery is still there,
right?
Connected to the root. And so like, the gurgling of the stomach is just something that, to me, I resonate with that a bit,
No, that's good. I haven't seen that, or I haven't noticed that in English translations, that aspect of it, but it makes a lot of sense. Turbulence a good feeling, especially when somebody's stomach is all knotted up. And, like I suffer from anxiety, and when I get anxiety, I can feel it. Like it's a physical thing of knotted up and tense, and you're thinking back to, wow, when it used to be so good, and now it's so like, so this really resonates with somebody with anxiety.
And I think that's there. Like, so that imagery, it's imagery, right? So we can take it in a couple of different ways, but it is within him, right? That this is that feeling that's there. So my mind just kind of went that direction. Out of that desperateness and the sinking down turbulence, we just have this call, right? He's speaking to himself still, right? So wait or hope for the Lord, right? For God. And I tried to capture some of that hifil in there, like this: wait expectantly, be patient for God, wait for him. There will be praise again, right? For again, I shall praise him. And then part of the translation here, this final line, right? The saving help of my countenance. So the Yeshua, right? The deliverance. So, in New Testament kind of Christian talk, right? Salvation is an eschatological thing. And we don't really talk about salvation or deliverance in our everyday life. But that is exactly how the psalmist would think about it. He's not talking about, I shall praise him when I get to heaven. He's saying there's going to be a time in the future while I'm still alive where God will deliver me from this state and bring me back to himself. So it is a very present hope. And
it's plural.
Yes.
Could be more than one. Naturally, I would take this as more than one occasion of deliverance, like the ongoing salvation that's going to
and so sometimes I translate these nouns as the acts of saving help, right? Like, so it's the very multiple acts that are there. But to your point, maybe I'll have to edit my translation a little bit. But I think you're right. There is the plural sense of the one who continues to save. I put my countenance, my face. And again, I think there's some dispute on how to handle some of the pronouns here in this verse. And then especially with the Elohe at the beginning of verse 7.
Yeah, because it looks like, my guess, and tell me if I'm wrong, you're taking the Vav here as should go with Elohai. So this would be a case where you're breaking with the Masoretic.
So in 12, right, we have the same exact ending, but now face and God are separated that way. And so I thought that was a good case to be made for the same thing happening in that first refrain as well.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And we find it at the end of Psalm 43 as well, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for non-Hebrew readers, don't worry about it. But for Hebrew readers, you can see this phrase together, these three words in the next line down in verse 12, They're right there, and it's broken differently this time.
I'm agreeing with a lot of the translations too. So I'm not on my own on that one. So like NRSV, NIV, the JPS, the Tanakh, like King James does it too. NASB does it.
So going on through the psalm then, this is the refrain throughout the poem, like you said, three times. So these would be the chorus.
Yes.
And these are all the verses.
And it's almost like this, he's trying to understand how, like, come on, soul, like, let's go. Like, why are you sinking down? Become turbulent, right, within me. You need to change, right? Wait expectantly for God, and I shall praise him again, right? Maybe he's frustrated, right, that he's allowed the words of his enemies to affect him in this way.
Right.
Right. And so he's trying to remedy a way out of it, right? And remind himself, right, that this isn't the end, right? That there will be more deliverance in the future.
Your translation in verse 5 and 6 then. So he keeps lamenting this in between. Yeah. He's back up in verse 7, within me my soul is sinking down. Therefore I'll remember you, like looking to the past, the lands of Jordan, the peaks of Hermon.
Yeah. So I have a little bit of a different translation here, the insignificant mountain. In Hebrew there, it's just the small mountain. And verse 7, that last word there, mitzah, or
Yeah. Small.
Yeah, mitzah.
Yeah.
Yeah, small mountain. So yeah, I took that to be there's a contrast between Zion and where he is now, right? Because he's talking about the peaks of Hermon, right?
Right.
This is the tallest mountain in the region.
Yeah.
And I think he's playing with it, right? But this is, I'm not calling you from the temple, like where I was in the previous section. I'm calling you from this insignificant mountain. And if you've done any reading on, the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds of Hermon, this is an important cultic site for Baal. Yep. You have Baal, Hermon, and all throughout history, there's sanctuary sites for different gods on the peaks of Hermon. A lot of people think that he's been exiled up into the north, is calling out from Hermon towards the temple. But I'm taking this as a bit of a jibe at Hermon a bit.
Yeah, it's ironic because Hermon is the dominant mountain.
Yeah, exactly, right?
People ski on Mount Hermon today.
Yeah, so even though this is a strong, really it's a strong mountain, for him it's an insignificant mountain.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So then the next verse, because the next verse has been used in songs and poetry, but I don't know anybody that knows what it means. Tahom el Tahom, like this is the word in Genesis for the abyss, the watery deep. So what does this mean? Deep calls out to deep in the sound of your water shafts.
Yeah.
What's going on here? All your breakers pass over me. All your breakers and your waves pass over me. I can figure that one out. That's the
exactly right.
Being overwhelmed. So but this one,
it's weird imagery, right? So Jonah prays something similar, right? He uses this language of breakers and waves, and his situation makes a lot of sense because he's in the ocean,
right?
And the breakers and the waves are coming over him, but we have this psalmist that's here in the mountains, right? And so I'm actually taking this, and maybe Lord of the Rings has ruined my imagination a bit, but when Gandalf falls into the deep of the mountain, right? And you have the water at the deep core of the mountain. That's kind of the imagery that pops into my mind. Because you do have this sense of the water under the earth. And, Hermon does have a lot of cave systems that go deep into the mountain, and there's waterfalls, right? So it could be in the sound of your water shafts, like creation still responding. Now, all your breakers and your waves pass over me. Certainly when Jonah uses it, he's using this as a negative image, right? That he's about to drown, right? And the waves are breaking over him. But I go back and forth with this one. Is it a negative image or is it a positive image? Is it talking about drowning or is it talking about, how did I put it here? I'll read you a little bit of my commentary here.
It was a sneak peek of coming attractive.
A sneak peek, if I can find it. All right. So the translation insignificant mountain instead of the otherwise unattested Mount Miser. Pick up on the irony of the geography and a polemic perhaps against the association of Hermon with Baal. And then I say here, the presence of Yahweh is not on top of the high mountain. Rather, the echoes of his powerful voice are heard from deep within, right? Deep calls to deep. And I reference there Psalm 29 with these, the thunderous voice of the Lord calling out. And I say the prayer of Jonah uses similar phrasing, but they mean something quite different. Jonah notes his separation from God, and that he had been afraid of never seeing God's house again. And so the breakers and waves passing over him are understood as signs of judgment against him. In Psalm 42, however, they're signals of God's overwhelming presence, despite the distance between the psalmist and Zion, even at a distance, the overwhelming voice of God can still be heard. And so connecting the breakers and waves with God's voice, overwhelming the psalmists rather than as literal, he's not like under a waterfall about to drown or something,
Right. But even what you're saying is metaphorically, this is not describing, because most of the time, metaphorically, the image of breakers and waves is chaos and destruction and danger.
Yes.
And so what you're suggesting is in this instance, because of the context and him being in the mountains, so it's not literal. This is God's voice responding, and it's overwhelming in a good sense or in a responsive sense.
Exactly. And so he could be hearing the thunderous roar of a waterfall, but that's the sound of the Lord to him. Right. In a place that's far away from the temple, right? And so it's all kind of washing over him. That's kind of the way I'm taking your breakers and your waves.
Yeah.
But admittedly, I think you're right. It's almost always used as a negative image, but it just doesn't seem like a negative. If that's negative, then deep calling out the deep should also be negative because of the parallelism. And I just don't see it as being negative, but
right.
I'm willing to be corrected on that one.
Well,
but,
it seems an ambiguous image at best.
Yeah.
I think what's unarguable is that it's overpowering.
Yes.
Tehom is the source of all uncertainty and all chaos. And, in the ancient Near East, that's gods would have to overcome it in order to create. And so, but in the biblical text, it's something at God's command. He speaks and when the way. I kind of see both of what you're saying and maybe what other people might suggest is that God can be both. Aslan can be good but not safe.
Yes. Well, and it's like in the water imagery here is so much different than it was in that first section, right? So the tears down his cheek, right, are the things that are his food, and now we have this whelming water presence.
Yeah.
That's filling up all around him, right, in this sense. And he hears the Lord's voice in that. Yeah, this next verse, right, it just jumps into that same kind of feeling, right? By day, the Lord commands his covenant loyalty or his hesed, and by night, his song is within me, right? So this is a positive situation, right? So that's why I didn't like the feel of the negative, taking breakers and waves is negative in such a positive environment otherwise. So that's trying to work through that.
Yeah. And he still goes in verse 10, it seems alternating. Verse 9 he seems like his commands is chesed, his song is with me, here's a prayer. But then verse 10, now here's the prayer.
Yeah.
But the prayer is why have you forgotten me?
I know, right? Yeah. So it's this going back, right? And my take on this, and again, I could be wrong here, but I take verses 9 and 10 as a prayer he's not actually saying yet, right? So that's why I translate it as a future, right? I shall say to God by rock. So he's formulating a prayer in his mind. And then in the third section, he actually prays it, but he changes it. So it's a really fascinating development in the Psalms. So because he uses the word forgotten here, right? Why have you forgotten me? Yeah. But if you jump down to the beginning of Psalm 43, it's why have you rejected me? Not why have you forgotten me? So the refrain has made him more bold, I think, in his prayer once he gets to Psalm 43. But yeah, he prays for God to vindicate him, but then why have you rejected me? And I decided to keep darkened because of what happens in Psalm 43 when he prays for God to lead him to the light, right? So I think there's some imagery happening here that kind of gets masked a bit by translating that as mourning. Because I think a lot of translations do this. Yeah. Verse 10 in Hebrew.
Because they're paralleling.
Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? And mourning is the usual translation there, which is a good translation, right? I think that's exactly what he's talking about. But one of the cool things with poetry is, in English, I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for how good we are with working with imagery.
Yeah.
Because I think if we would translate, why must I go about darkened by the oppression of an enemy? We'll get to mourning.
Yeah. It's over-explaining the imagery. It's over-explaining the poem.
Yeah, because I think what's wonderful is really when you get to chapter 43, send out your light and your truth and lead me. That becomes such a stronger prayer when you have the contrast with the darkness that he's been walking around in.
Yeah.
And we just miss that, right, with the way that we translate it.
Well, I think
So,
that's one of the things when I teach our Psalm videos here, and I always do my translation, and I always say, now this is my woodenly literal translation, because my goal is I want them to see, those who don't know Hebrew, at least to be able to see the language underneath.
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
in discussion, we can explain the imagery. But I think letting them see, this is how the Hebrew psalmist decided to depict this artistically using, these images. And when we over explain it, it makes it more readable, but it makes it less poetic and it makes it less beautiful.
Yeah, and there's there's a lot of things we lose, obviously, in the translation from Hebrew to English. And so I remember reading Robert Alter put out a book on how to translate a couple of years back.
Yep.
And I loved his advice was don't overcorrect.
Right.
Leave these things, because most of our readers, we can put two and two together with, all right, this is figurative language. What could this mean? We're capable of doing that because our own poetry works the same way. But I think we know how hyperbole works. We know how figurative language works. And so we shouldn't.
Our songs do it. Our songs, our pop culture songs do it. They use poetic imagery all the time and don't explain it. And we know what they mean.
Yeah. So leave it. So we can leave it. Yeah. And I think it'll enrich it a bit for us because, and I know you've talked about this in some of your other Psalm videos, but the repetition of words, right? That happens a lot. And even in the same Psalm, they're translated differently. And we lose something with that because we don't get to see how that word develops throughout the Psalm or, sometimes, these authors, especially in the wisdom literature and in Psalms, they love to do word plays, right? And in English, if we don't alert the readers to that, we just miss something of what makes this poetry so wonderful, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Wrapping it up then, he repeats the refrain. His enemies are, that's what the oppression of his enemies. And then he comes to the next, the third movement, which is Psalm 43 in our English Bibles.
Yes.
And so any idea why they would have originally separated this? Off the top of your head?
It is a different kind of prayer. It's a much bolder prayer. It's not as self-reflective. You do have a prayer for justice that happens here at the beginning. I know scholars that have debated through this, they think 42 was a psalm on its own at one point, and then maybe 43 was added later, kind of developing the psalm a bit. And so maybe that's why they're two separate.
Yeah.
But we see that same thing happening in other Psalms, like Psalm 102. Scholars see that there's like a development probably over time where the Psalm grew, but it's in the same Psalm, right? And it's not divided up.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say, but I do think there's something like with Psalm 9 and with Psalm 10, right? That at the very beginning of Psalm 10, you have that callback, right, to Psalm 9. Like, you've promised to do this and you haven't done it. Like, what's up? I see that same thing happening here with 43. And so I'm not sure why they separated it, but I keep it the same. And I think most commentators do nowadays.
Yeah.
But it is true. It is separate in the Hebrew text. So, I'm not sure.
Interesting to get inside the head of the Masoretes sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's the phrase again. He asked the same question. So,
yes,
if it is a separate song, it's picking up the same tune.
Yes.
I was going to say the whole point is getting back to the presence of God, getting back to, like Michael Morales would say, ascending the mountain of the Lord. And so that's part of his longing. Bring me back to your holy hill, to your dwelling places, the altar of God, the joy of my rejoicing, praise you with a lyre. One of the, if it's a son of Korah or a temple musician, this is the longing for the restoration of that cultic worship, that temple worship.
And I think he's good with the prophets too. So verse 1, there is a justice element here that proper worship of the Lord and living justly go together. Right? It's something the prophets do all the time. And it's here, right? Vindicate me. He's asking God to plead my case. And this reference to a not Hesed nation or a not Hesed. Yeah. So how do we take that? I put it a disloyal nation. Oh yeah. Goya is right before that. Yeah. From a Goya, not Hesed, right? Lo Hasid. So could that be deliver me from a people that is not in covenant with the Lord? So you could take it as like a pagan nation. I don't like using the word pagan, but you get the idea. Like a nation that's not in covenant with God. Or is he talking about deliver me from your own people who are not living faithfully or not living loyally to the covenant. And I kind of like that better.
Yeah.
But in any case, there is a justice element going on here. And so he's seeing the vindication and the restoration of worship.
Right in verse 1, these are two interesting words for non-Hebrew readers. Vindicate me, shofteni.
Yes.
Shofteni. Shofate is the word, shofat is to judge, and a judge is the participle. One who is judging is a shofate. And so he's asking God, like, to judge, and judge is not always a bad thing. This is a case where, Andy's translated it with vindicate, which is like judge favorably, make it a public declaration of my being in the right. And then this word bariva, how would you say it? You make a case?
Yeah,
like
plead my case.
Plead my case in English, but case my case in Hebrew. It's like a lawsuit. I mean, like a bringing charges against someone publicly in a way that could bring them down, that could ultimately, depending on what the charges are, it could be capital. So ariv is not like, take somebody to small claims court because, their dog pooped on your lawn or something. This is a serious thing. And he's asking God to be the one to plead my case, to try my trial, or that to me, that's the vocabulary that people aren't aware of how ubiquitous it is in the Hebrew Bible. These terms. When I see these terms, riv and shofet, they jump out to me just because it's all covenant language.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's with this language of shafat, right, to judge or to really to do justice. Christopher Wright, in his ethics, Old Testament ethics for the people of God, he this really great chapter on righteousness and justice, and he talks about doing rightly, or doing rightness is upholding kind of God's ideals, right, for how we should live, with doing justice, restoring us back to righteousness. So this prayer for vindication is, right, restore justice, right, make things right again. Yeah. And in this case for me, right, oh God. And so it's not the way we use this justice language now, I don't think. And certainly not usually in our theological conversations about what it means to be righteous or to be just. But I think that's something that the Psalms can help us recover.
Yeah. Well, so this psalm ends, he's looking forward. This psalm doesn't end with resolution, I notice. Right. Is he's looking for, he is resolved within himself, or there's a I like this psalm because there's tension. He's expressing some confidence, but he's also expressing, he ends with the same refrain. Yeah. His soul is still sinking down. He's still got that churning gut within him. And he also is pledging, wait expectantly, like watch and hope for God, and I shall again praise it. Like there's a note of like certainty, even while expressing discontent. And that's a recent video we've done here on the channel, is holy discontent. To me, this verse, this refrain is a great expression of holy discontent, because it's trusting, but it's also saying, just because I trust you with the outcome doesn't mean I understand, like, or approve of what I'm currently going through. So fix it. Stop it.
So it captures both of those things, right? Yeah. The turbulent moment and the hopeful future, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not despair. It's not Psalm 88 level of darkness, but it is acknowledge. I think that's the big thing. The Psalms acknowledge the reality of suffering, and they don't sugarcoat that reality. Like they're just, this is what it is. And you're allowed to tell God what you think about it. And to me, I think that's the most freeing thing. And that's where I get the value of the Psalms. And when I'm talking and doing ministry with people, is encouraging them. The Psalms, you're mad at God. You're impatient with God. You're anxious about what God's doing. The Psalms have you covered. They've got the vocabulary for you.
Ellen Davis, I don't know if you're familiar with her work at all in the Old Testament.
Ooh, I know the name, but I can't off the top of my head think.
Yeah, she has a great book called Getting Involved with God. It's just reflections on the Old Testament. And she has this great chapter on lament and the cursing Psalms, even like prayers for justice. And the way that she kind of talks about it is, these Psalms are here because they do give us vocabulary to use in our prayers. And they do force us to think about things we don't like thinking about with ourselves, right? Yeah. So maybe you shouldn't pray, God, destroy my enemies. But have you thought that before? Right. Probably. Right. Yep. And why haven't you brought that before the Lord?
Yeah,
right?
he knows it.
Yeah. And if there's anybody who can change your heart, it's God, right? So these Psalms kind of force you to admit to things about yourself that you wouldn't normally admit.
Yeah.
But also put you before the Lord in that situation and help, develop your character. And the Psalms kind of disciple you a bit and the way you should go. Yeah. And so I kind of like that idea too, that even if you're not one that's very like introspective, Psalm 42 and 43 force you to be a little bit, right? Yeah. And so there's where the value lies in some of this, is it teaches you how to think a bit better or more well-rounded, I guess, about yourself.
Yeah, that's the formative aspect. And that's what the Psalms, part of that, like you mentioned at the beginning of our talk, hiding them in your heart, being shaped by them. That's the value of it. And it's so foreign. The Psalms are just foreign to a lot of people. We know they're like vitamins. We know they're good for us and we know we should take them, but we just don't think to. We read other stuff and preach from other stuff. And so your commentary you're working on now.
Yes.
What are, if you would recommend maybe one or two commentaries or Psalm-specific resources for viewers, something at a popular level and then something at a technical level, what would you? This
is what I struggle with when I teach the Psalms class every other year is, what commentary do I have the students buy? So I've really benefited from John Goldingay's big 3-volume set, just profound thinker for the Old Testament. And I don't know how he writes as much as he writes. I feel like he's had these massive commentaries, but he deals a lot with textual issues. I've really appreciated that one, but that's a more heavy hitter.
That one's actually right here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it's volume 1, it's 3 of these.
Yeah. 3 of those, right?
Yeah.
James May's commentary I like quite a bit as well in the interpretation series.
Oh, okay.
And he has a volume called The Lord Reigns. That's kind of a supplement to that. And both of those together are really wonderful. The Nicot Jacobson.
Rolf Jacobson. And
Yeah. And why am I blanking? I'm always blanking. I have it at home.
I have it on Accordance. I use it. And I haven't gotten to the volumes that aren't by Jacobson.
Nancy DeClassy Welford, Rolf Jacobson, and Amy Tanner, I think is the 3. But yeah, the Nicot series is good. And then I've picked up, I haven't worked through all of it yet, but James Hamilton just came out with a new one. And I've liked what I've read in it, but I haven't worked with it as much. I really enjoy Robert Alter's translation. I don't know if you've done anything with his.
I checked it. Yeah. I haven't, I don't have it in Accordance or Logos, so I can't display it on screen alongside the other. Yeah. If I did, I would. I wish I had that and the Koran English Tanakh in my digital libraries, but I don't. But yeah, Alters is I always appreciate him.
And there's a little, I don't have it here at the office, but it's called the New Catholic Version. It's like a really small green Psalter. You can find it on Amazon. It's a really great translation, and they have a bunch of notes at the bottom. And for me, I assign that for my students as well. It's just a good basic translation with a lot of notes at there that incorporate the Psalms into your spiritual life. So that's more of like a lay level kind of a book.
Yeah. You saying Golden Gaze at the top. Well, Richard Middleton turned me on to Golden Gaze commentary because Richard said Golden Gaze Psalms commentary is the best commentary. I think it's his favorite of all time.
High praise.
And I was like, great. Every time I read Golden Gaze, half the time I'm like, this is awesome. And the other half I'm like, no. And so it's like,
he's the best kind of commentator in a way.
Yeah. That's what you want to do is you want to read those people that you're like, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
But when they make a point, you're like, man, that's super profound. And so when he told me Golden Gaze, I was like, are you sure? He's like, trust me. And I picked it up, and sure enough, it's excellent.
And if you have listeners that want to dive into the history of interpretation a bit, Athanasius has this little tiny letter called the Letter to Marcellinus. And it's probably my favorite Psalms piece of writing throughout church history.
Really?
Yeah, the way the early church is able to talk about how the Psalms connect to your spiritual life, we just don't have that. I mean, we have that idea, but they're just so eloquent in the way they talk about it. And there's something that I long to be able to do. But yeah, Athanasius, you can find it online, and it's a really great little read.
I'll link that in the video description.
Yeah. I forget which manuscript it was attached to, but it was, I think, Codex Sinaiticus. It was included with the Psalter as like an introduction to the Psalter. So it was really important in the early church, and we've kind of just forgotten about it. But
Well, Andy, thank you so much for stepping into the dojo, man. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person at SBL.
Yeah.
We'll connect there.
Yeah, it'll be great to meet you in person.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on and your wisdom and your insight in the Psalm. So let us know once the commentary is out and published. I know it's got a while to go, but we'll
Yeah,
have to come back on and talk about it some more. So
definitely.
maybe we'll let you take us through another Psalm.
Okay, that'd be great.
All right, brother. Take care. Have
All
a
right.
great one.
You too.
So I want to thank Andy for coming and spending the afternoon with us here at Disciple Dojo. I'm going to put in the video description below links to some of the resources that he mentioned that we talked about, as well as the link to our playlist here on the channel where we have been teaching through the Psalms. And so I hope this was interesting, informative, maybe gives you something of a new perspective in some ways on a particular Psalms or just the Psalms in general. That's what we want to do here, though. We want to encourage people. We want to equip people to go deeper in their understanding of Scripture. That'll do it for now. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. As always, keep training.